Hello, I'm Des Dearlove. Welcome to the Thinkers50 from the Fox Club in London's Piccadilly. My guest today is Erin Meyer. Erin is a professor at INSEAD and an expert at cross-cultural management. Erin, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Des.
Erin, the subject of managing across cultures is something that's become increasingly important, I think, across the world. There's a lot of things been said about it, a lot that's been written about it. What's different about your take?
Well, I can tell you, having worked in this topic over the last 17 years, the landscape has changed dramatically. So it's really a fascinating area to be working in. And one of the things that I've seen, just looking at the changes, is that up until probably 7 or 8 years ago, mostly what people were needing who were working across cultures was to understand how another culture was operating. Because it was usually about two cultures working together. So, maybe you would have a French person who was wanting to better understand American management, or maybe you would have an American who was wanting to understand the various management styles of different European countries. But today, the landscape has changed entirely. So what we've seen is, just over the last 10 years, suddenly these global teams are coming up all over the place. And a huge percentage of managers in multinational companies are in situations where they have team members from many different countries who are collaborating together. And they have to understand not how do I manage one culture and how do they perceive me, but how do these various cultures on my team perceive one another, and how can I improve the collaboration between those two cultures?
So that's sort of the relativity between the cultures. Is cultural relativity, is that the phrase you use?
That's right. So I think it's a very important point to bring up, because you can't start thinking about global teamwork or multicultural interaction unless you think about relativity. Let me give you an example. So I was working with a global team a few months ago, and I had on this team a group of British people, a group of French people, and a group of Indians. And at the beginning, we had just French and British. And I was talking to the British group at one point, and I asked them, what's it like to work with the French? And I remember, one of the British said to me, well, Erin, you know the French. You know the French, they're very chaotic, they're disorganized, they're often late. They said, they're always changing the topic in the middle of the meeting, so it's very difficult to follow them. Okay, so that was the British perception of the French. A little bit later, this Indian group joined, and at one point I was with the Indians who were working with the French, and I asked these Indians, what's it like to work with the French? And the Indians said to me, well, Erin, you know the French. They said, they're so rigid, they're so inadaptable, they're so focused on the structure and timeliness of things that if you don't tell them weeks in advance exactly what's going to happen in the meeting, in what order, it makes them very nervous. So these two cultures have these totally opposite impressions of the same culture. That's cultural relativity. So one of the things that managers need to understand is that just because your culture has one perception of a culture that you're working with doesn't mean another culture will have the same perception. And the goal that I have in my work is to present a framework that helps people decode the way that these different cultures perceive one another. So it moves us from a cross-cultural space to a multicultural space.
But isn't there a sense that with globalization, we keep hearing so much about globalization, isn't there a sense that there's this homogenization, harmonization, that individual cultures are becoming less important, not more important? What's your sense of that?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a really interesting question because people ask me this all the time. I would say on a daily basis, someone says to me, Erin, okay, culture was important to management a decade ago, but today we are all working across cultures. We have technologies that help us work with other cultures frequently. Aren't cultures becoming more similar? And in fact, I would say that the impact of cultural management has, on the contrary, increased radically over the last 5 years. And if you think about it, 10 years ago, when people were working across cultures, mostly those individuals were either business travelers going to those countries, or they were expatriates living in countries that were not their own. But today, who's working across cultures? Often they're people who get up in the morning, they live in their own country, they go to their desk, they get on their email, and then over email, they're negotiating with suppliers in other countries, they're selling products to clients in other countries, and they might never go to those countries or have any visual cues that help them understand the cultural contexts. that those clients or suppliers are in. So in other words, it becomes much more complex for them to even begin to understand the impact that culture is having on their communication, although likely the impact is rising every year.
All right, I'm going to ask you, you mentioned your framework, I'm going to ask you about that in a second, but first of all, here you are, you're an American living in France. What are the big challenges for you trying to communicate in that situation?
Okay, so as you know, I was raised in the Midwest of the US, and then I spent most of my adult life living in different countries. I live in France currently, I'm married to a French person. Maybe I'll just give you one example that I often see with clients who are working back and forth between these two cultures that I know so well. So one is that in my own culture, in the American culture, there's a very strong emphasis in evaluating performance, that if you have something negative to say, if you have criticism to provide, that you should provide 3 positives before you give the negative. So that's something that's very deeply anchored in American culture, that it shows respect to start by appreciating someone's performance before you criticize their performance. In France, that's not the case. So in France, the school systems are set up so that there's a very strong emphasis on pushing children to strive for excellence. So there's much less explicit positive feedback that's given in those schooling environments. And in a business environment, also a good deal of positive feedback is given implicitly. In other words, it's not said out loud. The idea that you would say explicitly 3 positive things before moving on to the criticism, that's not done frequently. So what happens now? We have an American manager who's leading a team of French people. He wants to tell someone on his French team that her performance is not acceptable. He starts by telling her 3 things very explicitly that he thinks she's doing well. And she's thinking, wow, I've never received so much positive feedback. By the time he gets to what he meant to say, what she needs to do differently, she's not even listening anymore. So he may leave that meeting feeling that he very clearly communicated what she needs to do differently, and she may leave that same meeting feeling that she just received really positive notes about her performance. So I think for an American manager in that type of situation, it's very important to recognize that if you want to motivate teams in different countries, that you need to develop a flexibility to provide performance reviews, evaluations in different methods. And the more we can learn to be flexible, working in different ways with different populations, the more effective we'll be internationally.
We had, I mean, it could be very simple things too. We have a very good friend and client in Abu Dhabi, but things got off to quite a tricky start because we were so reliant on email, trying to communicate. And Ali doesn't really do email. And that miscue right at the beginning, not realizing that, of course, in that particular culture, in Abu Dhabi, it's very relationship oriented.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example. I actually have a part of my framework that focuses specifically on how trust is built in different cultures. And it looks at what I call relationship-oriented trust versus task trust. So in a culture like yours, in British culture, the most trust, or a larger percentage of trust in a business environment, is built because we do work together. We see we do good work, we like working together, and therefore we learn to trust one another. But in a culture, well, like the Emirati culture, for example, in the UAE, one of the many cultures you'll come across in the UAE, trust is built much more over personal relationship building, meaning that we spent time getting to know each other at a personal level, we spent time connecting together, so I trust you. So then if you relate that to communication mediums, I mean, the most task-oriented communication medium is email, right? There we get our work done, but we don't have much opportunity to connect.
We're busy people.
That's right. Yeah. Next, maybe we'd say telephone calls, then face-to-face formal meetings, then face-to-face informal interactions. And what I generally say for anybody newly working with a relationship-oriented population is that at the beginning you should choose a communication medium that's as far to the right as you can. And then later you can move back. So what that means is that if you can't go face-to-face, you should choose the telephone. as usually task-oriented mediums like email are not used very frequently in those cultures or contexts.
Okay, now you've mentioned this framework a couple of times. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, I have eight elements that I research that I have found have the strongest impact on cross-cultural or multicultural business. And just to give you a couple of examples, and for someone, for example, who's working on a global team, I think one of the big ones is disagreement. So in every culture, of course, if you're working on a team, sometimes you're going to feel disagreement. But the question is, what's the most appropriate way to express disagreement in different cultures? In some cultures, really just saying it straight out shows transparency and openness. In other cultures, if you say it straight out, you may have a very strong negative fallout of giving disagreement in that way. So that's one element. Another element would be, for example, if you're working with clients in other cultures, understanding communication patterns is probably critical. So I have these 8 scales that I work with, and as countries are positioned up and down them, we can then think relatively about how various cultures perceive one another and think about tools and strategies to help bridge those different cultural patterns.
Erin Meyer, thank you very much.
Thank you.